The laughter started the moment he reached for his coffee. His hands were shaking, a slight but visible tremor that made the styrofoam cup rattle against the folding table. One of the young soldiers nudged his buddy and whispered something that made them both snicker. The old man heard it clearly. "Looks like Grandpa's had a few too many." He said nothing. He simply wrapped both hands around the cup to steady it and took a slow sip, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the walls of the VFW hall. He had learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some people weren't worth correcting. The tremor in his hands wasn't from alcohol. It was from lying motionless for 9 hours in sub-zero temperatures on a ridge in Afghanistan, waiting for a shot that would save 12 American lives and end one enemy commander's reign of terror. The nerve damage was permanent. The medal he'd earned was classified, and the young men laughing at him had no idea who they were mocking. If this story moves you, type the word steady in the comments before you continue. Walter Briggs had come to the VFW fundraiser because someone at the shelter had mentioned there would be free food. He hadn't been inside a Veterans of Foreign Wars hall in almost 6 years, not since his life had unravelled in ways he still didn't fully understand. The hall was decorated with American flags and service branch banners, and the walls were covered with photographs of members past and present, young faces frozen in time beside older faces weathered by years of carrying memories that civilians would never comprehend. Walter didn't see his own photograph anywhere, which was exactly as it should be. The missions he'd completed weren't the kind that got commemorated on walls. They were the kind that got erased from official records and lived only in the nightmares of the men who'd carried them out. The fundraiser was meant to support a new veterans outreach program, and the turnout was impressive. Active duty soldiers from the nearby base had been encouraged to attend, and several dozen had shown up, their uniforms crisp and their confidence evident. They moved through the crowd with the easy swagger of young men who had completed basic training and believed they understood what it meant to serve. Among them was a group of 4 who had positioned themselves near the refreshment table, watching the older veterans with barely concealed amusement. Their leader was a specialist named Donovan, 24 years old, an armourer who had never deployed but spoke about weapons with the authority of someone who believed technical knowledge was the same as combat experience. It was Donovan who had first noticed Walter's shaking hands, and it was Donovan who would soon learn a lesson he would never forget. Walter found a seat in the corner away from the crowd. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of dignity preserved under difficult circumstances. His beard was grey and neatly trimmed, his posture straight despite the slight hunch that age had carved into his shoulders. He ate slowly, savouring the hot meal in a way that only someone who had known real hunger could appreciate. The tremor in his hands made the plastic fork difficult to manage, and he switched to a spoon without embarrassment. He had adapted to his limitations years ago. A sniper learned patience above all else, and patience meant accepting what couldn't be changed while focusing on what could. The demonstration table had been set up near the centre of the hall, covered with various military equipment meant to educate and entertain. There were inert grenades, a display of historical ammunition, and several weapons in various states of assembly. The centerpiece was an M24 sniper rifle, the bolt-action precision weapon that had served American military snipers for decades. It had been disassembled into its component parts as an educational display, and throughout the evening, various attendees had attempted to reassemble it under the guidance of the armourers present. Most civilians gave up after a few minutes of confusion. Even some of the active duty soldiers struggled with the finer points, unfamiliar with this particular weapon system. Donovan had been running the demonstration for the past hour, showing off his knowledge to anyone who would listen. He could reassemble the M24 in just under 2 minutes, a respectable time that he announced proudly after each demonstration. He had noticed the old homeless man in the corner and had pointed him out to his friends with a smirk. "Watch this," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm going to invite Grandpa over. $20 says he can't even identify what weapon this is." Walter was aware of the young soldiers approaching before they reached him. Situational awareness wasn't something that faded, even when everything else did. He continued eating, giving no indication that he'd noticed them until Donovan spoke. "Hey, old-timer, you a veteran?" Walter looked up slowly. "Yes." Donovan grinned at his friends. "What branch? Let me guess. You look like a cook, maybe supply." The other soldiers laughed. Walter's expression didn't change. "Army!" Donovan nodded with exaggerated respect. "Army! Great. Well, we've got a little demonstration going on over there. Educational stuff. You should come check it out. Might remind you of the old days, back when you could hold a rifle without spilling your coffee. More laughter. Walter set down his spoon and looked at Donovan with eyes that had watched men die through a scope at distances most people couldn't even comprehend. The look lasted only a moment, but something in it made Donovan's smile falter slightly. Then Walter nodded and rose from his seat. All right. The small crowd around the demonstration table parted as Donovan led the old man forward, clearly expecting entertainment at the veteran's expense. Walter's trembling hands were even more noticeable now, and someone in the crowd whispered about whether he was suffering from Parkinson's or simply old age. Donovan gestured grandly at the disassembled M24 spread across the table. This is an M24 sniper weapon system. The Army's been using it since 1988. You ever see one of these in your supply closet? Walter looked at the components laid out on the table. His hands were still shaking, but his eyes were absolutely still. Yes, I've seen one. Donovan smirked. Great. So maybe you can tell us what all the parts are. This here is the Remington 700 Action, Walter said quietly. Modified with an HS precision stock. Leupold Mark IV scope, M3A model. Detachable box magazine, 5-round capacity, effective range of 800 meters, though the weapon is capable of accuracy well beyond that in the right hands. The smirk on Donovan's face flickered. Around the table, conversations had stopped. One of the older VFW members, a Vietnam veteran named Harrison, who had been watching from nearby, straightened slightly in his chair. He had seen something in the old man's eyes that the young soldiers had missed entirely. Donovan recovered quickly, his pride stung. Okay, so you memorized the spec sheet. That's different from actually handling the weapon. You probably haven't touched one since... What? Before I was born? Your hands shake so bad I bet you couldn't even pick up the bolt without dropping it. He turned to his friends for validation, and they provided it with dutiful laughter. Then someone in the crowd spoke up, an older woman, a VFW auxiliary member who had grown tired of watching the mockery. Why don't you let him try? If you're so confident, there's no harm in it. Donovan hesitated. He hadn't expected to be challenged, and certainly not by someone who should have been on his side of the generational divide. But the crowd was watching now, and backing down would make him look afraid of an old homeless man with shaking hands. Sure, he said, recovering his bravado. You want to try to put it together, old-timer? I'll even give you a head start. Take as long as you need. He pushed the disassembled components toward Walter with a condescending smile. Just try not to break anything. Walter looked at the parts for a long moment. The tremor in his hands was still visible, a constant reminder of the cold that had damaged his nerves on that ridge so many years ago. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. Do you have a blindfold? The request was so unexpected that Donovan actually laughed. A blindfold? You want to make this harder? Buddy, I don't think you understand. I've done this before, Walter said. I'd like to do it properly. Harrison, the Vietnam veteran, was already moving. He pulled a bandana from his pocket and approached the table. I'll time it, he said, holding up his phone. His voice carried an authority that made Donovan step back instinctively. Someone blindfold this man and clear the table. Give him room to work. The mood in the crowd shifted. This was no longer a joke at an old man's expense. This had become something else entirely, though no one yet understood what. Walter allowed Harrison to tie the blindfold around his eyes. Darkness enveloped him, but it was a familiar darkness. He had performed this assembly hundreds of times in conditions far worse than this. In sandstorms where visibility was zero. In the pitch black of a hide site where any light would have meant death. In the moments before missions where the muscle memory of his craft was the only thing standing between success and catastrophe. His hands were still trembling as he raised them over the table, and someone in the crowd whispered that this was going to be painful to watch. Then his fingers touched the first component, and everything changed. It was as if the tremor existed in a different dimension from his movements. His hands shook, yes, but they shook while moving with a precision and economy of motion that seemed almost mechanical. The stock came first, his fingers finding it instantly and positioning it as the foundation for everything that would follow. The barreled action slid into place with a soft click that spoke of perfect alignment. The trigger assembly followed, then the magazine, then the scope, each component finding its home with a certainty that suggested his hands knew this weapon more intimately than most people knew their own bodies. The crowd had gone completely silent. Even Donovan had stopped smirking, his mouth slightly open as he watched something he couldn't fully comprehend. This wasn't just assembly. This was something closer to ritual, performed by hands that had done this exact sequence thousands of times over decades of service. 40 seconds after he'd begun, Walter Briggs set the fully assembled M24 on the table and removed his blindfold. The silence lasted another 3 seconds. Then Harrison spoke, his voice hushed. 41 seconds, with the scope. He looked at Walter with an expression that mixed awe with recognition. I've seen that technique before. Not many units train that sequence. In fact, I can only think of one. Walter said nothing. He simply looked at the weapon he had assembled, his trembling hands now resting on the table, and waited. Harrison stepped closer, lowering his voice so that only Walter and a few nearby listeners could hear. That's the OTIC sequence, Special Operations Target Interdiction course. They only taught that exact assembly pattern at one school, to one kind of student. He paused. You weren't supply, you weren't a cook, you were a shadow. Walter met his eyes. I was a lot of things, most of them classified. Donovan had gone pale. The other young soldiers had backed away from the table as if distance could separate them from what they had done. Around them, the older veterans in the crowd were beginning to understand what they were witnessing. A shadow was army slang for the most elite snipers in special operations, men who operated alone or in pairs, far beyond any support, completing missions that would never be acknowledged. These were soldiers who could lie motionless for days waiting for a single shot, who could disappear into any environment and eliminate targets that conventional forces couldn't touch. And they were standing in the presence of one, a man they had mocked for his shaking hands and homeless appearance. Harrison pulled out his phone again, this time to make a call rather than time an assembly. He spoke quietly for several minutes, and when he hung up, his expression had changed further. He approached Walter with something close to reverence. I called a friend at Benning, described what I just saw, mentioned your approximate age and the nerve damage in your hands. He made one call of his own and called me back. He paused, struggling with what he was about to say. Your record is sealed, everything. But he told me 2 things. First, the tremor in your hands is documented. Result of a mission in 2008 that saved a 12-man team and eliminated a target that 3 previous attempts had failed to neutralize. You held position in -20 temperatures for 9 hours because extraction was delayed. The nerve damage was considered an acceptable trade for what you accomplished. Walter said nothing, but something in his eyes shifted. A flicker of pain at the memory, quickly suppressed. And the second thing, he asked quietly. Harrison's voice dropped even lower. He said that if I was actually standing in front of the man he thought I was describing, I should tell him that the community hasn't forgotten, and that the shot in Kandahar is still talked about at the schoolhouse as the most technically perfect engagement in modern sniper history. The crowd had pressed closer, trying to hear, but Harrison waved them back. This moment belonged to the old man with shaking hands who had just demonstrated mastery that most people couldn't achieve with steady ones. Donovan pushed forward, his earlier arrogance completely evaporated. Sir, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Walter looked at him for a long moment. In his decades of service, he had seen young men like this countless times, confident in their training, certain of their knowledge, completely unprepared for the realities they would eventually face. He had also seen those same young men grow into warriors worthy of respect, tempered by experience and humility. He didn't see a villain in Donovan. He saw himself at 24, before the missions that had carved away everything soft and left only purpose. You judged what you saw, Walter said finally. That's human. But what you see isn't always what's there. The man with shaking hands might have earned that shake doing something you can't imagine. The woman in worn clothes might have sacrificed everything she owned for someone she loved. The veteran who looks broken might have been broken in service of keeping people like you safe. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every life he had taken and every life he had saved. Don't look at the surface. Look deeper. Ask questions before you mock. Respect the story you can't see. The rest of the evening transformed completely. Word spread through the hall about what had happened, and veteran after veteran approached Walter to shake his hand, his trembling hand that had accomplished things their steady ones never had. Someone brought him a plate piled high with food. Someone else offered him a ride to wherever he needed to go. Donovan and his fellow soldiers stayed, but their posture had changed entirely. They stood at the edge of the group, listening to the older veterans swap stories, learning lessons that no training manual could teach. 3 weeks later, Walter Briggs moved into a small apartment near the base, funded by a combination of VA benefits that had finally been properly processed and contributions from the local VFW chapter. Harrison had personally taken charge of navigating the bureaucracy, ensuring that every benefit Walter had earned was actually reaching him. The nerve damage in his hands would never heal, but the damage to his life was finally being addressed. More importantly, he had been invited to speak at the base's sniper school, sharing knowledge with the next generation of shooters who would carry on the tradition he had helped define. Donovan requested and received permission to visit Walter at his new apartment. He arrived with a bottle of good whiskey and an apology that he'd clearly rehearsed but still struggled to deliver. Walter listened quietly, then poured 2 glasses, his hands trembling as always but not spilling a drop. "You want to know how I did it?" he asked. "How I can assemble that rifle blindfolded even with hands like these?" Donovan nodded, unable to speak. 10,000 repetitions, maybe more. I lost count somewhere around year 15. The body remembers what the nerves forget. The muscle learns what the mind can't force. He took a sip of whiskey. "But that's not really what you're asking. You want to know how I ended up homeless? How someone who did what I did ended up being mocked by a kid at a fundraiser?" Donovan's face reddened with shame, but he didn't look away. "Yes, sir," Walter nodded slowly. "Good. That's the right question, because the answer matters more than how fast I can put a rifle together." He told Donovan about the missions that broke something inside him that the VA didn't have a code for, about the classified nature of his service that made accessing benefits nearly impossible, about the system designed to protect operators that sometimes failed to protect them from falling through its cracks, and about the fact that none of that suffering had diminished his skills or his identity, only his circumstances. "You don't stop being what you are just because the world stops seeing it," Walter said. "The man I was on that ridge in Afghanistan, holding position while my hands went numb, is the same man who reassembled that rifle at the fundraiser. The only thing that changed is how people looked at me, and that says more about them than it does about me." Donovan left that night with a new understanding of service, sacrifice, and the invisible wounds that veterans carry. He requested a transfer to a position working with veteran outreach programs, determined to ensure that others like Walter were found before they fell too far. The M24 that Walter had assembled that night was mounted in a display case at the VFW hall, with a small plaque beneath it that read, "Assembled blindfolded in 41 seconds by a soldier whose hands never stopped shaking and never stopped serving." Beneath the weapon, they placed a photo that Harrison had managed to obtain through channels that officially didn't exist. A younger Walter in unmarked fatigues, holding the same model rifle, standing in terrain that would never be identified, from a mission that would never be acknowledged. The shaking in his hands was invisible in that old photo, but everyone who looked at it now understood that the steadiest hands weren't always the ones that appeared still. If you believe that respect should be given freely until it's proven undeserved, and that every veteran deserves to be seen for their service rather than their circumstances, subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that strength comes in forms we don't always recognize.